Did you know there's a provincial election campaign underway in Ontario? There sure is. The premier of that province, Conservative Doug Ford, called an early election because his poll numbers look stable and he wants to keep on getting it done. Originally, the election was supposed to be held in June 2026. Doug Ford's Conservatives absolutely cruised to victory in the last Ontario election held in 2022. But if you're like Doug and you think that means Conservatives had an overwhelming mandate, you'd be terribly wrong. Even though Doug's party snagged 40% of the votes, voter turnout in that election was a dismal 44%, the lowest voter turnout in the history of that province. Looking at those results in terms of strength of mandate, the Conservatives got 1.9 million votes out of a total of 10.7 million registered voters. So about 18% of eligible voters in Ontario said the Conservatives were the right choice. Hey, that doesn't sound like much of a mandate to me, but that's the way elections work. Now that those living in Ontario have another chance to get up off the couch and actually vote this time, there are some things that the Conservatives are hoping Ontarians have completely forgotten. That's what this video is about. A rapid-fire look at 8 of those things. Here we go. First up, the carbon tax. Are you one of the victims of the very effective and unrelenting Conservative misinformation campaign about Canada's carbon tax? It's okay, don't feel bad for getting duped. They really did a good job of convincing a lot of people that the carbon tax is the source of everyone's trouble. Know why there's a carbon tax in Ontario? Before Doug Ford's Conservatives took over, Ontario had a cap-and-trade system in place to address climate change. Cap-and-trade systems target big emitters of greenhouse gases. Doug cancelled that, and then the federal government did what they said they were going to do. If a province didn't have its own program, they would have to use the federal carbon tax program, and that's what happened in Ontario. Then Doug Ford spent up to $30 million taking the feds to court to fight the carbon tax, which he lost. He also forced gas stations in the province to place anti-carbon tax stickers on their pumps, until that was ruled unconstitutional by the courts. There's an interesting report by Environmental Defence from 2022 that puts the price tag of Ontario's Conservatives' battle against climate policies at more than $10 billion. Had Doug not killed the cap-and-trade program, there wouldn't be a carbon tax in Ontario, and none of you would have fallen prey to Conservative disinformation on that topic. 2. Removing sick days and freezing minimum wage. Back in 2018, shortly after being elected, Doug Ford's Conservatives repealed a planned minimum wage increase from $14 an hour to $15 per hour and scaled back paid sick days for low-wage earners, presumably believing that who better than this group to be able to afford to miss a day's wage if they're sick? Now, to be fair, under huge pressure and probably reluctantly, Ontario Conservatives have increased the minimum wage since then to where it is now in 2025, $17.20 an hour. A sharp contrast to Doug Ford's early efforts to keep businesses from having to pay workers a halfway decent wage. Number 3, sweet deals for developers. Outside of Ontario, there may not be a lot of awareness of something called the Greenbelt, which is a protected area around Toronto and neighboring areas. It's an environmentally sensitive zone with really productive farmland. After earnestly telling Ontario voters that he wouldn't open the Greenbelt to development, Doug Ford's Conservatives did some fancy talking behind closed doors, and presto, a few of the Premier's developer friends bought up some land within the Greenbelt, which magically skyrocketed in value when Doug announced the housing crisis was too critical, there was nowhere else to build, so the Greenbelt needed to be opened up. There's a current ongoing RCMP investigation, and while Doug Ford's Conservatives reversed course in 2023 because of the erupting scandal, concern around the future of the Greenbelt and other environmentally sensitive areas in Ontario continues. Number 4, the cost of beer in convenience stores. Doug Ford's Conservatives in Ontario have prioritized making alcohol more widely available, and while I won't get into the societal impacts of easy access to alcohol, Ontario Conservatives sure did spend an awful lot of money on one key part of that strategy, getting beer into grocery and convenience stores. And sure, maybe you don't care about that, maybe you think that's actually a good idea, but Doug wasn't satisfied with just putting a plan together and following it. He wanted to do it fast, so he decided to speed up the whole thing by a year. That triggered a few extra costs, $661 million worth. All told, this effort is costing Ontario taxpayers $1.4 billion, according to the Financial Accountability Officer's report issued in January of 2025. That's a lot of money to be able to grab a six-pack while you're filling up the truck. Number 5, secret government mandate letters. A mandate letter is essentially the marching orders that the Premier of a province gives to cabinet ministers responsible for running the various departments and services. Normally, these mandate letters are made public in the spirit of transparency and accountability. But, starting back in 2018, Doug Ford refused to make these mandate letters public. There were freedom of information requests and court cases, all leading to a decision by the Supreme Court of Canada in February 2024 that indeed Ontario's Conservative government could keep this information secret. A big win for Doug Ford, and hey, he finally won a court case. But not so great for anyone who thinks trustworthiness and transparency in government is a reasonable thing to expect. Number 6, crumbling healthcare. Hospital emergency department closures have become a regular thing in Ontario. In fact, in 2024, it was the worst year on record for ER closures. The cause of that mostly relates to human resource shortages, and you'd hope that it would be the number one priority of a provincial government, making sure the healthcare system is strong. Sadly, for those living in Ontario, Doug Ford's Conservatives are less interested in that responsibility. There's still more work to be done on the alcohol file, after all. The Financial Accountability Officer in Ontario published a report in March 2023 that showed Doug Ford underspent on healthcare in 2022 by $1.7 billion. That made Ontario's healthcare spending the lowest in Canada that year. Nice. Number 7, the provincial debt and deficit. In 2024, Doug Ford's Conservative government tabled the most expensive budget in Ontario's history. The projected deficit in that budget is just under $10 billion, despite the budget a year earlier projecting a $200 million surplus. I bet you thought Conservatives were good with money. Number 8, public sector salary suppression. In 2019, Doug Ford's Conservatives passed legislation capping wage increases for public sector workers, including healthcare workers, and many others, to 1% per year for 3 years, ignoring the collective bargaining process that is, of course, enshrined in law. This went exactly as everyone predicted it would. There were more court challenges, and in a huge surprise to absolutely no one, Doug Ford lost yet another court battle, had the legislation ruled unconstitutional, and had to pay retroactive increases to the affected workers. There are, of course, many more examples of how negatively Conservatives are impacting the lives of Canadians right across the country, but who knows if any of this will be enough for those living in Ontario to do their civic duty and vote at the end of February 2025. Ontario Conservatives got elected with the votes of 18% of eligible voters last time. I'm sure the people of Ontario will recognize that even if Doug Ford gets elected to hold on to the Premier's chair for another 4 years, it should be with a clear majority of voters expressing their opinion at the ballot box. You can do this, Ontario. Get voter turnout to a respectable level. Somewhere over 80% should do the trick.